All right, so most of you guys are familiar with the Pythagorean Theorem, but I just want to go over one really important thing. I can't stress enough how important it is that when you're plugging in those values for that right triangle, you first need to figure out which of the three sides is your hypotenuse. So that trick we talked about before fall break was to identify your right angle and go across from it. So right here's my right angle, that opposite side, that's going to be my hypotenuse. Why that's important is because when you plug in your formula, you've got a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That hypotenuse, the one across from the right angle, is the one that's all by itself. So you've got these two legs added together, and then your hypotenuse is all by itself on the other side. Your two legs, A and B, can be flip-flopped. It doesn't matter which one's A and which one's B, but that C cannot change. There's only one option, and it's the side across from that right angle. So if we take a look at A, again, the first thing I'm going to do is find that right angle, draw my arrow to identify that this side right here, side 7, is my hypotenuse. So when I plug in, so I've got a squared plus b squared equals c squared, starting with my formula. X and 2 are my legs. It doesn't matter which one's A and which one's B, but I just have to plug them both in on this left-hand side. So I've got x squared plus 2 squared equals. Again, that hypotenuse, that's C, the one that's by itself, is across from that right angle. In this case is 7. I'm going to leave x squared alone for right now. 2 squared is the same thing as 2 times 2, so that's 4. And then 7 squared is the same as 7 times 7, which is 49. So my next step is to subtract 4 from both sides, because again, my goal is to get that x all by itself. So that's going to leave me with x squared equals 45. And then the final step I don't want you to forget is to take the square root of both sides, because again, I don't want x squared, I want x. So we got to take the square root to kind of cancel out that x squared, and it's going to leave me with x equals the square root of 45. Now I want to quickly kind of go over two different ways to write this. X equals 45 is technically the exact answer. This is the exact value of x, but a lot of times that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, right? What is the square root of 45? When we see that, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So sometimes the problem is going to ask you for the exact value, and that's what this is right here. Sometimes it's going to ask you to round it. It might ask you to round it to the nearest tenth or the nearest hundredth. So in order to do that, we would need to plug that into our calculator. And in this case, if we round it to the nearest tenth, we would get 6.7. If we round it to the nearest hundredth, we get 6.71. So it just depends on what the directions ask. All three of these are technically correct answers, but if I do ask you for a specific one, such as the exact value to the nearest tenth or the nearest hundredth, you would need to make sure you put it into the proper format. So again, for the rounding, just real quick, if you take a look, when you plug it in, you get this big old long decimal. So for the nearest tenth, I rounded it to that first place. To the nearest hundredth, I rounded it to that second place, and I had to bump that up to make it a 1. If we take a look at the second one here, again, here's my right angle, the side across of it's x, so this is my hypotenuse right here. So when I plug that in, my legs are 4 and 8, and my hypotenuse is x. Just real quickly, compare the difference here. In A, I was looking for a leg. In B, I was looking for a hypotenuse. So your x can be any one of these three. So just be careful not to assume that it is the leg, or assume that it's a hypotenuse. So 4 squared is 16. 8 squared is 64. 16 plus 64 gives me 80. Take the square root of both sides. Again, the exact answer is just the square root of 80. However, if I would ask you to round it, so if you would, probably a good idea to try typing it into your calculator, but when you take the square root of 80, if you round it to the nearest tenth, you get 8.9, and if you round it to the nearest hundredth, you get 8.94. So again, exact value, rounded to the nearest tenth, rounded to the nearest hundredth.